Chapter 11 is entitled Consumers and Situations. Now, looking at that title, you might be a bit perplexed as to what exactly it means. But in order to understand it, you need to have a little context. So, as I've talked about more than once, this field of consumer behavior has been well informed by the field of social psychology. And in the field of social psychology, there are two perspectives that are constantly being dissected. One is what we call the trait perspective, that the way people behave, react, think, feel has to do with personality traits, and they're more enduring. In the Christian language, we'd say they're God-given. But there's another piece that is equally important, and that is how do we respond in situations? What do we do when we're stressed for time? What do we do when we're presented with lots of information and we're bombarded and it's chaotic and we're not sure what to focus on? So this particular chapter will just talk about a lot of situational elements of behavior. So outcome 6, we'll talk about how value varies with situation. We'll talk about how time impacts situation and behavior. We'll talk about shopping as an activity and how that has a great impact on how we think and feel about consumer activities. We'll talk about different types of consumer behavior, whether it's planned, unplanned, impulse, etc. And we'll talk about the atmospherics, the idea of experiences and how they help to inform consumer value. So let's talk about how value varies with situation. So situational influences really are contextual effects that are independent of enduring consumer brand or product characteristics. So it's really about context. Another word for situation is context. What are some categories of situation influence we care about? One is time, another is place, a third is condition. So that would be how, in fact, you're consuming or considering that brand or purchase. In this case, we're talking about the place as a contextual effect. So in other words, at a movie, popcorn becomes more valuable. Very true. I think we'd all recognize that we wouldn't pay $6 for a bucket of popcorn anywhere else but at a movie theater. Secondly, we want you to know the different ways that time impacts consumer behavior and how this situation factor is relevant. So many times there's a sense of urgency, and marketers do exploit this. Additionally, there's often this issue of time that relates to seasonality. Thirdly, there's this idea of time of day, and another way to talk about that is what we call the circadian cycle. In the world of marketing and advertising, we have something called advertiming, and that is that companies buy advertising using a schedule that runs the advertisement primarily at times when people will be most receptive. So we've studied it, we know when they're going to be receptive, and that's when we want our ad to run. Third objective is really about shopping, and just how does this whole activity get impacted by situations? We talk about shopping pills. So on one side, married partners report that shopping together can reduce financial risk, so you can make joint decisions. But on the other side, consumers report more pleasure when they shop with friends versus family members. What do you think? Which is true for you? Now, what are some shopping activities? Well, we have one that's about just acquiring something. We have one that's more epistemological or epistemic, which is definitely just based more on the episode itself and what happens while we're there. We have experiential, which, lots of retail take advantage of that today, and even websites do, just the experience of shopping itself. And then impulsive, we buy something quickly because it's in front of us. Here's some different shopping activities and their value, and we have on one side this idea of utilitarian. We've heard that before, how useful, how much use do we see the value of that product or brand, versus hedonic, which comes from the word hedonist. I'm sure you've heard that word, but just it's more indulgent. So PSV, or personal shopping value, that's the overall subjective worth of a shopping activity considered all costs and benefits. So again, we have the two that we already referenced. But we also talk about retail personality, and that's the way a retail store is defined in the mind of a shopper. You have affective quality, which is retail positioning that emphasizes a unique environment. But you also have functional quality, which is really more about the tangible things that someone's going to get from that shopping experience. Finally, we have impulsive consumption. These are consumption acts characterized by spontaneity. So what about spontaneity versus planned or even impulsive behavior? So you have unplanned. First of all, you have impulsive behavior, right? This is where I just disregard consequences. I just buy what I want. But then you have unplanned behavior, which isn't so much that I'm disregarding consequences. It's just many times we need to be reminded of things. We go to a store and we think we need a pair of blue jeans, but then when we're there and we see a t-shirt, we go, oh gosh, I totally forgot I need t-shirts too. It's that kind of thing. And that's when we look at the bottom between how much of this is really about our emotion, about the sensory side of feeling good versus the usefulness of what we need. Now, how does personality trait impact this? Well, there is a trait, this impulsivity trait, which represents how sensitive a consumer is to getting an immediate amount of feedback. Additionally, we have consumer self-regulation, and this is a tendency for consumers to inhibit outside or situational influences from interfering with their shopping intentions. It can be action-oriented, it can be state-oriented. So now, what are some questions distinguishing low from high self-regulatory capacity? Well, here's a statement. If I had to work at home, action-oriented people say I would get started right away. State-oriented consumers would say I oftentimes have trouble getting started because when they look around, there's too many distractions. And you can read through the rest, but I think it's worth considering. Compulsive folks can be very harmful. It can be uncontrollable. I mean, it can absolutely be a problem. I'm forgetting the name of the book, or the movie, but I know there was a movie recently. It's kind of a chick flick that was certainly, ultimately there was a happy ending, but it was about a woman who was just obsessed with shopping. Some of you out there may know what I'm talking about, and it can definitely be a problem. What about this idea of atmospherics, and how do they create value? Well, this is the emotional nature of an environment, or more precisely, the feelings that are created by the aura of the physical attributes. And you better believe marketers and communicators spend a whole lot of time thinking about this. Servicescape is really the physical environment in which the consumer services are performed. So what's the quality of the environment? Well, you have the functional quality, which is whether the employee is knowledgeable, what about pricing and convenience, and then you have the affective quality, and that's, how friendly are the people, what about the lights, what about the colors, what about the way it's laid out. I mean, there's a very definite difference between a Target and a Walmart. Walmart intentionally is a little more chaotic, a little more crowded. It's trying to play off this idea that, it's not as pristine and beautiful, and it's going to be cheaper. So in terms of factors that help create a competitive advantage with the atmosphere, one is fit. So we need appropriateness of the elements for the given environment. And the other is congruency. We need consistency of those elements with one another. Some of the elements, I'm just going to go back for a minute, that we think about are odor. Oh, goodness. Our odor. Another one is music. A third is color. The fourth is merchandising. You might not know what that means, but that tends to be more sort of how the merchandise is laid out. There's a whole field around it. Social setting, and then what about virtual shopping? I mean, how does the internet play into this? And here's this idea of crowding. So to some extent, we like there to be some crowds because we feel like, gosh, if everyone else is around us buying it, it must be good. But we don't want too much crowding or it can overwhelm us, right? So how does this person shape the exchange environment? How attractive they are makes a difference, and that's why marketers use attractive models many times. We may have a social comparison, and that's a naturally occurring mental and personal comparison that you have with the target individual in the environment. We're making that comparison all the time. Again, a note I want to make, though, here is, partly at a Christian school, and we have one discussion questions on this time, but we're not going to be able to spend too much time on it, but I do want to consider it, and that is, I think as Christians, we hope that we aren't trying to manipulate others' behaviors based on purely the atmospherics, and or that we are wise to that as well, right? Because we know that we can waste a whole lot of time and money and God's resources if we are too worried about just the aesthetics of what's around us. This last one here is understanding what is meant by antecedent. Antecedent is this thing that happens beforehand. Here are all the different antecedent conditions. You have economic resources, you have an orientation, you have a mood, you have security. The next piece you need to think about is value, and how does enhancing value by making consumers feel more safe, how does that all work? Security personnel will help, increase number and prominence of security cameras, brightly lit parking lots, etc.